mean, we know that the Prime Minister, and any Prime Minister, I'm sure Mr Key will be the same, runs the government from afar sometimes through text message from London. I mean, the technology allows the Prime Minister to have a much greater role and to have to trust less their ministers than they used to in the past.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, Matthew, but I think the other part of the whole equation is this, that access to the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition is crucial. If you have a media setup that allocates you at the most 2 minutes on the 6 o'clock news bulletin for politics, what are you going to do? You haven't got time to go out to all the other spokespeople. You're going to focus exclusively on the leaders. I mean, that's a problem that the media creates for itself. I think that there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the gallery and the political leadership of the main parties, which keeps them, very closely related to one another. And nobody dares, whether it be the politician or the journalist, step too far out of line.
Well, that's always existed.
Well, no, it hasn't. It hasn't always existed.
There's been things that the press gallery has known about MPs and yesteryear for decades and never reported.
We're not talking about that. We're not talking about affairs, that people have had, or things
that don't relate
to the politics. What we're talking about now is the very thing you alluded to. We have education policy not really being covered. Health policy not really being covered.
But that's because
Foreign
there
affairs
isn't any.
not. Oh yes, there is.
There is barely
policy,
any, and there is no.
And there are real issues involved in all of those things. Take, for example, the National Party's policy on testing 7-year-olds. Now most of the educational profession believes that to be a complete nonsense. Doesn't know how you can do it. Talks about the huge variation in competence among 7- and 8-year-old children, and how are you going to set a standard, and where are you going to set it? These are all perfectly legitimate questions.
That's been debated in this campaign.
That hasn't been debated in any depth.
Debate, and the counter is that it's information parents want it, and I'm sure the education professionals, so-called professionals,
I know which sort of parents want that sort of information. Nice middle-class parents want to make sure their kids are better than Johnny from the wrong side of the tracks. That's what that's for.
If we do look at the other reason, I think there's been something of a vacuum. I think the Electoral Finance Act has something to do with that.
Yeah, but it doesn't apply to the news media.
No, but it does in this way. What it's meant is it's excluded, in that case, say the teacher unions, from being able to campaign against testing for 7-year-olds if they wanted to. The sign-off for becoming a third party was, I think, a month or so ago. So what it's meant is, in the past, during election campaigns, NGOs, unions, business groups have sort of dumped ideas into the election campaign that we've all debated for a day with the exclusive reference. Think about that. We spent a day debating the Skyhawks in 2005.
Matthew,
that was thanks to them.
The intervention of third parties, the use of full-page ads or targeted mail drops. Yeah, that has arisen since the mainstream news media, particularly television, whether it be TV3 or Television New Zealand, has simply ceased to provide the opportunities for people, politicians certainly, but also experts, to sit around and talk about this. How can you have an informed electorate, that's able to make a democratic judgment when the maximum amount of time that you're given on mainstream, news bulletins is 1 minute 37? It's not possible. You can't do it.
Well, the Melbourne Cup got more than 1 minute 30.
I want to move on from this. I want to move on this because we've only got a certain amount of time on the show. But I do take your point. I want to talk about that because it does seem that we're missing the other MPs. It doesn't seem to me to be a contest between National and Labour. It seems to me to be a contest between John Key and Helen Clark. And I want to ask you, Matt, how can John Key's claim of change really be taken seriously when the only difference between John Moderate Key's shadow cabinet and Don the Murray Get Too Much Brash's shadow cabinet is basically that Don and Catherine Rich aren't in it? I mean, it's the same old grey privatisation faces that were kicked out 9 years ago.
Well, you've got, I think, two people I'd mention who have come in would be Tim Grosser, who's joined the National Party since then, Chris Finlayson, who was a top lawyer for Ngāi Tahu, and others has joined. I think there's been some change.
I mean, you've got Lockwood Smith, you've got Morris Williamson, you've got Murray McCulley, you've got all of those people that were there. Where is the change?
All parties. Where's been the change in Labour? Helen Clark was Deputy Prime Minister in the 1980s.
Helen Clark's going on
Phil
trust.
Goff was a minister in 1987.
Helen Clark's going on trust. John Key's going on change.
There is absolutely no doubt that there were attributes of policy that Don Brash, the person, brought to the National Party that has gone since John Key became leader. I
Well,
think
they've been
that
pushed
even
out of
within,
sight. I
and
don't know
look,
whether they've gone.
I'm probably closer within the National Party to the people on the right of the National Party.
No.
I can tell you that those sort of people have accepted that world has gone, that happened in the 80s and 90s. There has been change. Their whole attitude has changed, and I think they understand now they are going to govern in the way I think Holyoke governed, and they're going to deal with problems. I'm not even sure. I'm not sure
see Williamson and Smith in the cabinet.
I think that at least one of them will miss out, and I think that they will both be gone by the 2011 election. Whether one of them is brought in so that there is someone who's been a minister before, who's sat around a cabinet table.
Yeah,
before.
there'll be a reshuffle after.
But then I think you'll find they'll both be gone by 2011.
Here's the thing. After the votes are counted, if National wins with ACT and Peter Dunn, I'll tell you what will happen. There'll be a report from Treasury. There'll be the briefing papers to the incoming government. They'll say, we are facing an enormous crisis. Here is how we deal with it.
The first bit's true.
And John Key is a chameleon. John Key, his colour changes depending on the political environment in which he finds himself. John Key was dark blue when he first came into Parliament as the member for Helensville. That's why he talked about, shedding blood alongside our brothers, with the Americans and the Australians in Iraq. That's why he talked about communism by stealth. However, now he's leader and he's facing an election where he knows none of those ideas are going to fly. And so, he's pale pink and sometimes he's even bright red, as he was over the redundancy package last week. But I'll tell you what, people should think about what sort of colour that chameleon, adopts when he's Prime Minister, when the only people that he has to please are his own caucus and the Treasury officials who are saying slash spending, lower the boom on organised labour.
You're assuming that Mr Key's government is going to be some sort of suicide government that's going to come in and doom itself in 2011.
He's going to find himself in exactly the same situation that Roger Douglas created by saying in a document he was going to devalue by 20%, but also the same position that Jim Bolger found himself in. The phone will ring on the Prime Minister. We have bad news.
There's MMP. This completely. I think you're absolutely right that when the books are opened after the election, and I still think there's time if Labor wished to tell us the truth about the deficit prior to the election. If this election's about trust, Cullen must know what the truth. Well, Cullen must know what. That deficit is. We know it's 30 billion over 5 years. He will have information that says it's higher than that. He could release that now. We know that the deficit in the year just gone was $2 billion worse than expected.
All right, Matthew,
so if this is about trust, so we know there's going to be a crisis, right?
Matthew, you've used up your time on that because I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that you're thinking of them as a one-term government. They're not going to make a whole lot of changes because they want to stay in power over long term. But we all know that you can make a lot of changes right at the start. You can claim, especially with something like financial crisis, that gives you 3 years to get the love back and to get the support back. If you're going to make
Naomi Klein wrote a whole book on this. It was called The Shock Doctrine. The whole book about it, and it's very clear how it works. And the other thing is, don't forget, John Key has got a referendum coming up on MMP, and if MMP is given the heave-ho, then shock doctrine becomes even more capable.
That wouldn't happen by 2011 anyway.
Well, with National Act and Peter Dunn in tow, I'm pretty damn sure he could do it by then.
I think that the suggestion, while the crisis that is being faced is far greater than what was encountered in 1990, I think the suggestion that in this political environment with MMP, and even if you think that MMP might get changed one day, it's not going to be changed by 2011. I don't think there's any possibility of a government coming in and behaving in the radical way that the governments of 1984 and 1990 did. It just
Matthew, let me just state this. Everybody I've talked to, and I've spoken to people, whose business is business over the last few weeks, they say that what is coming down the track is absolutely horrendous.
That's right.
I heard Jenny McManus say it last night on TV3. And whoever wins this election is going to be faced with some very, very tough choices. Now, New Zealand history tells us that the National Party, founded to look after the interests of business and the rural sector, will take one tack in the face of a major economic and social crisis. Labour, formed by the trade unions in the interests of working class New Zealanders, its instincts,